Bohemian Rhapsody has been heard by more people than almost any other piece of popular music in the 20th century. It has been number one in the United Kingdom twice, once in 1975 and once in 1991, after Freddie Mercury's death, when an entire generation that had been too young to hear it the first time discovered what the previous generation already knew. It has been performed in arenas across 6 decades. It has been the subject of a film that made hundreds of millions of dollars and introduced it to people who had not been born when it was recorded. Almost everyone alive today has heard it, and almost no one knows what happened the night EMI told Freddie Mercury it would never work. Not the official version, not the sanitized account of institutional resistance overcome by commercial reality. The actual night, the room after the meeting, the conversation between Freddie Mercury and Brian May that took place when everyone else had gone, and the two of them were alone with what had just happened. Brian May has carried what was said in that conversation for 50 years. He has spoken around it in interviews across those decades, approached it, implied it, described its edges without describing its center. This is the story of that night, and of what Freddie Mercury said to Brian May that he has never forgotten. To understand what the rejection meant, you have to understand what 1975 meant for Queen. The band had been together for 4 years. They had released 3 albums, Queen, Queen 2, and Sheer Heart Attack, each of which had demonstrated the group's technical ambition and established a growing audience, particularly in the United Kingdom and in Japan. But they had not yet produced the song that would define them. They had not yet done the thing that would separate them from the very large number of talented and ambitious rock bands operating in Britain in the mid-1970s and place them in a different category entirely. Queen in early 1975 were a band on the edge of either breaking through into something permanent or subsiding into the respectable obscurity of groups who were always almost great. The pressure of that position was real, and it was felt by all 4 members, though each of them processed it differently. Freddie Mercury processed it by spending the first months of 1975 constructing, in his head and at the piano in whatever rooms he had access to, a piece of music so unlike anything Queen had done before, that it would either end the conversation about what the band was capable of or end the band itself. The piece of music that Freddie Mercury was constructing in early 1975 had been growing in his imagination for some time. The harmonic structure, the chord progressions, the specific movement from the ballad opening through the operatic middle section to the hard rock finale. These were not the result of a single session of inspiration, but of an accumulated body of musical thinking that Freddie had been developing across years of piano playing and years of listening to the specific range of music that had formed his aesthetic. He had been shaped by Liza Minnelli, and by opera, and by Led Zeppelin, and by music hall, and by the specific quality of theatrical excess that he had encountered in records and performances across his adolescence and early adulthood. Bohemian Rhapsody was not an accident. It was the inevitable product of a specific intelligence working on a specific problem for a long time. The problem was, what is the largest, most complete, most ambitious thing this voice in this band can do? The answer, which Freddie had arrived at before he walked into Rockfield studio in the summer of 1975, was already fully formed in his head. The recording process was the act of making what he already heard in his mind exist in the world for other people to hear. Rockfield studio in Monmouthshire, Wales, was where Queen went in August 1975 to record A Night at the Opera. They had booked approximately 3 weeks. The recording of Bohemian Rhapsody consumed a significant portion of that time, not because the band were uncertain about what they were making, but because what they were making was technically unprecedented. The vocal overdubs alone required the kind of sustained layering that pushed the studio's equipment to its limits. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and Freddie Mercury sang their parts hundreds of times across multiple sessions to build the operatic section, not dozens of times, hundreds until the tape literally began to wear thin from the repeated use. The engineers at Rockfield remembered it specifically. They had worked with many acts and had never seen anything quite like the level of precision and repetition that Queen brought to those sessions. Freddie Mercury directed the recording of his own voice with the authority and the specificity of a conductor who can hear in his head exactly how the finished thing should sound, and who will accept nothing less. By the time they were finished, they had something that no one in the studio had any doubt about. The question was what the record label would do with it. The first full playback of the finished Bohemian Rhapsody in the context of the wider Night at the Opera sessions was a moment that Brian May has described multiple times across his decades of interviews, always with a quality in his voice that suggests he is returning to something he has not fully finished processing. The four members of Queen in the control room, Roy Thomas Baker, the producer at the desk, the tape rolling, and then 6 minutes of music that was unlike anything any of them had heard on a rock record before, coming back at them through the studio monitors with the specific force that finished recordings have. When you hear them for the first time, the moment when the thing you have been making in pieces and in sections suddenly coheres into a whole, and you understand for the first time what you have actually made. The reaction in the room was not celebration exactly. It was something quieter and more serious than celebration. It was the recognition shared between people who knew music well enough to understand what they were hearing, that this was not just a good song. This was something else. And with that recognition came the specific, uncomfortable awareness that presenting it to a record label in 1975, a label operating in an industry with clear rules about what a single could and could not be, was going to be a conversation that none of them were entirely looking forward to. EMI's response to Bohemian Rhapsody was not delivered in a single meeting by a single executive. It was a more diffuse institutional reaction, a series of conversations and expressions of concern that accumulated into a clear position. The song was too long, too strange, too uncommercial, and too unlike anything that had previously succeeded to be released as a single. The specific figure of 6 minutes was cited repeatedly. Radio stations would not play a 6-minute single. 6 minutes was album track territory, not chart territory. The operatic section, which is now the most beloved and most imitated element of the song, was in 1975 the part of it that EMI found most inexplicable. A piece of music that sounded to executives who were not Freddie Mercury and had not spent years constructing it in their imagination, like an expensive and technically impressive mistake. The label's position was not delivered cruelly. It was delivered with the particular combination of bureaucratic certainty and genuine concern that institutional taste-making tends to produce when it encounters something it cannot categorize. They were not trying to destroy the song. They simply could not hear what it was. What happened between Freddie Mercury and the EMI representatives in the meeting, or meetings where this position was communicated, has been described in various accounts over the decades, and the descriptions share certain consistent elements. Freddie Mercury did not shout. He did not perform anger or outrage for the benefit of the room. He listened to what was being said with the specific quality of attention of someone who is receiving information they had already anticipated and who is deciding, in real time, what to do with it. The expression on his face described by people who were present was not defeat and not defiance exactly, but something more considered than either. He asked questions, he listened to the answers, and then he said something. The accounts vary on the exact words, but converge on the substance that made clear he understood the label's position and had no intention of acting on it. The meeting ended. People left the room in the way that people leave rooms where a decision has been made that everyone present knows is not the final decision. Freddie Mercury left last, or close to last, and the expression he wore on his way out was not one that invited conversation. The hours that followed that meeting, the specific quality of the evening after the institutional rejection of Bohemian Rhapsody, are not well documented in the official record because they were private. The press releases and the authorized accounts and the retrospective interviews tend to move quickly from the rejection to the resolution. Roy Featherstone, the EMI executive who eventually backed the release, Kenny Everett, the DJ who played the song on Capitol Radio and received the listener response that made the label's resistance commercially untenable. The chart success that followed. The official story proceeds efficiently from problem to solution because that is what official stories do. What it elides is the time between the hours and days when the problem existed without its solution. When Freddie Mercury sat with the knowledge that the thing he had made, the most complete and most ambitious and most fully realized thing he had ever created, had been told by the people with commercial power over his work that it was not viable. That time is where the real story is. And that time is where the conversation between Freddie Mercury and Brian May took place. Brian May has spoken across 50 years of interviews about Freddie Mercury's relationship to doubt in ways that are consistently illuminating. He has described a man who projected absolute certainty in his own artistic judgment and who, in private, was more complicated than that projection, more aware of the gap between his vision and what the world might be willing to accept, more conscious of the stakes involved in insisting on that vision against institutional resistance. The Freddie Mercury who sat with Brian May on the evening after the EMI rejection was not the Freddie Mercury who had walked into the meeting. Something had been released in him by the meeting, not confidence, which was never in question, but something more specific. A clarity, a decision. The kind of decision that people make when they have been told by an external authority that the thing they believe in is wrong and have discovered, in receiving that verdict, that their belief is stronger than the verdict. Freddie Mercury had always known that Bohemian Rhapsody was right. The rejection confirmed it. And what he said to Brian May that evening was the articulation of what that confirmation felt like from the inside. The specific words that Freddie Mercury spoke to Brian May on that evening are Brian May's to share or not share. He has kept most of them. What he has communicated in the careful and oblique language that he tends to use when discussing the most private moments of his relationship with Freddie is that what Freddie said was not about the song and not about EMI and not about the commercial situation that the rejection had created. It was about something more fundamental than any of those things. It was about the nature of making something that is entirely true, entirely, completely, without compromise, true to the vision that produced it and what that costs and what it demands and why. Despite the cost and the demand, it is the only option available to a person who has understood what art is actually for. Freddie Mercury, on the evening his masterpiece was rejected, said something to Brian May about the relationship between artistic conviction and the world's resistance to it that Brian May has described as one of the clearest and most direct things he ever heard Freddie say. Not theatrical, not performed. Simply true in the way that things said in private between people who trust each other tend to be true in a way that public statements never quite manage. Brian May's response to what Freddie said, his reaction in the hours and days that followed, to the conviction that Freddie had communicated was not simply agreement. He had agreed with Bohemian Rhapsody from the moment he heard it. His response was something more personal than agreement. It was the experience of watching someone he had known for 4 years, someone whose intelligence and ambition he understood better than almost anyone, arrive at a moment of complete and undefended clarity about who they were and what they were making and why it mattered. Brian May has said that there were moments with Freddie Mercury when the performance stopped, when the persona that Freddie constructed and maintained with such consistency and such skill simply was not there. And what was present instead was the person underneath it, saying something that the persona would never have said in public. The evening after the EMI rejection was one of those moments. And what was said in that moment has stayed with Brian May across 50 years, not as a piece of information, but as an experience, the specific experience of being present when someone who was capable of great things understood, completely and without reservation, that they were capable of great things and that this understanding was more important than any external verdict on the matter. The practical resolution of the Bohemian Rhapsody situation proceeded on a separate track from the private one. Roy Featherstone, the EMI executive, who had the authority to override the prevailing institutional caution, was persuaded through a combination of Freddie Mercury's insistence, the band's manager John Reed's advocacy, and the practical demonstration that the song was generating an extraordinary response when it was played to approve the single release. Kenny Everett, the Capitol Radio DJ, who had been given a copy of the song by John Reed, played it on air after being told not to and received a listener response so overwhelming that the station's switchboards were jammed with calls asking what the song was and when it was coming out. This was not an accident. It was the specific and irreversible demonstration of what Freddie Mercury had known in the room after the EMI rejection, that the song did not need the institution's permission to be what it was. It needed only to be heard. And once it was heard, once it entered the ears of people who had not been told in advance that it was wrong, the institution's position became irrelevant. Bohemian Rhapsody was released on the 31st of October 1975. It entered the UK singles chart and proceeded to number 1, where it remained for 9 weeks. 9 consecutive weeks at the top of the chart. Not as a novelty, not as a curiosity, but as the most popular piece of music in the country listened to by people who had been told, by every rule of the industry, that they should not want to listen to it. The EMI executives who had expressed their concerns did not, in the accounts that have emerged over the years, say much about what the chart's success meant to them. The institutional position was absorbed back into the institutional narrative without examination. Queen was now commercially validated, and the concerns that had been expressed about the song's commercial viability were quietly retired. What was not retired, and what could not be retired, was the memory of what had been said in that room, both the rejection meeting and the private evening with Brian May that followed it. The reason Brian May has never forgotten what Freddie said to him on the night of the EMI rejection is not that the words were wise or eloquent or particularly unusual in any literary sense. It is that they were true in the specific way that things said by people who are operating at the absolute limit of their conviction are true with a completeness and a directness that leaves nothing out and adds nothing in and produces in the person receiving them the specific sensation of being in the presence of someone who knows exactly who they are. Freddie Mercury spent much of his public life constructing the persona that the world required him to maintain. He was extraordinarily good at it. But there were moments in private, in the small hours, in the rooms after the meetings, when the construction was set aside and what remained was simply Freddie, saying what he actually thought to people he actually trusted. Brian May was one of very few people who was trusted enough to be present in those moments. And the evening of the EMI rejection was one of those moments. It produced a conversation that Brian May has protected across 50 years, not as a secret and not as a revelation to be deployed strategically, but as something that belongs to the relationship between two people who made something extraordinary together and who understood, in the aftermath of being told that extraordinary thing was wrong, what making it had actually been about. The song existed. The rejection had happened. The song would go on to define the band and outlast the decade and be heard by billions of people across the following half-century. And before any of that had happened, in the specific gap between the rejection and the world's response, Freddie Mercury sat with Brian May and said what he had to say. Brian May has never forgotten it. And in the truest sense, neither has anyone who has ever heard the song and understood what it cost to make it exist.